Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG and the School of Cities, I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our session on Behind the City Beat, a pre-election media panel. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring today's event with the School of Cities. The director, Maddie Smeticki, is over here, and one of the associate directors, Shauna Braille, is sitting at the front. We'll hear from Shauna at the end of the panel discussion today. I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Province of Ontario, TD Bank Group, and the City of Toronto. I would also like to thank our administrative coordinator, Elisa Tate, for helping to make this event happen today, and the event staff and technical staff at the Munk School. I'd also like to take this opportunity to welcome our new manager of programs and research, Thomas Hatchard. Take a minute to chat with him on the way out if you can. If you're tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. Today's event is being webcast, and the webcast will be available on our website in a couple of weeks. As we approach the municipal election, we want to focus on the issues that are facing Toronto. To this end, IMFG has posted 15 bold ideas by leaders in the Toronto region, and you can find these bold ideas on our website. I encourage you to take a look at them. Today, we're turning to people in the media to ask them what the issues are in Toronto. We're also asking about how to bring these issues forward in the media at a time when there is a lot of other news taking our attention, whether it be notwithstanding clauses or council composition or USMCA agreements. So let's find out what the issues are and how we get them discussed. So I am delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Rob Steiner. Rob is the director of the Fellowships in Global Journalism program here at the Munk School. He has a pretty impressive resume, and I'm not going to take too much time to go through it. But Rob began his career as a global finance correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where he won a number of awards. He went on to get an MBA from Wharton and worked as a business strategy executive at the Boston Consulting Group, and later as group vice president at Bell Glow Media. After that, he served as assistant vice president here at U of T in charge of strategic communications. So who better to lead a discussion on city issues in the media than Rob Steiner? Please welcome our moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Enid. And welcome, everyone. It's a real honor to host you here for this discussion. The program that I run, just by way of context, is, I think, the only program of its kind really anywhere still that recruits folks who are subject matter experts in their fields and teaches them to cover complex issues as reporters for media around the world. We have a number of folks with urban affairs backgrounds, city building backgrounds, who are working in our program right now and have over the last 7 years. And so in that capacity, we've collaborated with IMFG, and I should also say that we've received a lot of support from the Maytree Foundation. So I'm very grateful that Alan and Elizabeth and Marcus are all here as well. The elections that we're facing later this month really sit right at the nexus of two major dynamics in our political culture, I think. The one, of course, is the changing role of cities. We've watched for a generation now as cities have outgrown their constitutional subservience in this country, as they've become the front line for public policy on everything from immigration and climate change to infrastructure, social policy, health, economic development, really any issue that you can imagine coming up at Queen's Park or Ottawa or even at the United Nations actually hangs on our city councillors, on our mayors, and on our city budgets. And yet in this country, cities lack the power or sovereignty to do much about it. And if we thought we could keep kicking the can on that constitutional dilemma down the road, the debate in this province, if I could put it that way, has really shown that we've come to the end of the line. But our municipal and regional elections also come at a moment when the media's role in politics is itself shifting. And that's the other dynamic. Journalists are at risk in ways that are frankly unfamiliar to us in democracies, and that includes journalists right here in Toronto. They're being bullied and targeted as never before. The term fake news has become a convenient catch-all for anyone to dismiss news that they don't particularly like, and really the point of news often is to write and report things that people don't like to hear. And the term fake news ignores the massive amount of work that goes into every story that you read, hear, or see. Our media, and especially our local media, are also more economically vulnerable than ever before. And yet, in this country, as elsewhere, our journalists are also breaking bigger stories more regularly with more impact than at any time I've ever experienced. They have more tools, they have access to more data, and they are collaborating more deeply and more creatively than earlier generations. Almost every day, it seems, someone somewhere is breaking something important and having impact to the point that we've come to take that for granted, which we shouldn't. This election itself, in a way, is a consequence of municipal reporting 3 or 4 years ago that exposed problems, I'll use that word, in Rob Ford's administration and set the stage for the current clash between his brother and our mayor. So here we are at the crossroads. And new crossroads like these, unsettled places, are exactly the kinds of places that the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy likes to play. I should note also that we are in sort of the first round of public events that are being hosted by the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, something that integrates a new institution that integrates a global perspective on issues that are rooted in our communities and in our cities and provinces. Where the rules are unsettled, that's where we like to play. We like to convene those conversations, and that's why we've brought together 5 journalists who are outstandingly qualified to help us understand these news dynamics. Let me just get right into it then and tell you how we'll do this afternoon. Each one of our panelists here will have sort of 5 to 8 minutes, I'll watch the clock, to give us their quick thoughts on what they're seeing in this election campaign. I'll then throw a couple of questions out to the panel, and then we'll go to you, and I'll moderate your questions. And that will bring us towards the end, and my colleague, Shauna Braille, will come up and wrap up the events with her thoughts, and we'll end at 6 o'clock. So let me start then, and I'll introduce as we go through in order, so I won't do all of them in one batch now. But let me start by introducing Adrian Batra. Adrian is the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun and 24 Hours Toronto. In 2010, Ms. Batra was the Director of Communications for the Rob Ford for Mayor campaign, and then moved on to serve in the Office of the Mayor as Rob Ford's press secretary. She actually is born and raised in Saskatchewan. She has an undergraduate degree in political science and a master's in public administration. She worked at the Saskatchewan legislature as a researcher and with the Opposition Caucus Office. Before that, Ms. Batra also served in the Canadian Armed Forces, where she was a lieutenant and was nominated for a YWCA Women of Distinction Award. Adrian, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, an abbreviated one at the very least. And thank you to IMFG and to the Munk School for having us here tonight. You know, just sort of touching on what you said, Rob, this is an important election. We always talk about anything when it comes to the electoral process, that these are game changers. These are things that matter to us. But the municipal level of government, in my view, is the most important. It's the one where we get to see our garbage taken away. It's the one where we get to see our roads fixed. It's the one where we get to physically see something where your government and your tax dollars are actually going to fix it. And I know that I'm on this panel for some semblance of balance, and I appreciate that. But I come at this from not only from a public policy perspective, a former political staffer perspective, a conservative perspective, but also someone that is acutely aware of what it takes to cover and understand what it means to not only my readers, but for the average Torontonian, the average citizen, to know what is happening within their own level of government that matters to them most. So I have a few sort of angles by which I will try to tackle this. My esteemed panel here, many of whom I know personally and many of whom I've sparred with in different lives, have their own unique perspective to offer. But all I would offer you is this in the time that I have. In the perspective in which I serve now as an editor of a newspaper, I serve my readers, and my readers are Torontonians. They are just like all of you, and they want value for their money. And so when we decide what it is that we are going to cover, what it is that matters to them, far too often in this day and age, and this is not me lamenting about the state of the newspaper business, but the fact is, journalism is suffering, and we're not afforded the opportunity like we were used to back in the glory days, to be able to dive into the very local issues that would matter on your street, or on your street, or on your corridor. So we have to look at things from a broader perspective, things that matter to the city as a whole. So from that, you look at the mayor's race. Well, I would submit to you that this mayor's race in 2018 is a foregone conclusion. John Tory is going to get reelected handily. His opponents are fringe at best, and we will likely have the status quo for the next 4 years moving forward. So then I look at the municipal races, and now we can quibble as much as we want with respect to how we got here, and I'm sure we'll have some sort of a rigorous conversation about it. But we are at the point in where 25 seats are what they are fighting for. I recently wrote a column in my paper, and I used Councillor Joe Mahevic's language when it came to getting to where we are as the Hunger Games. We know who our tributes are. We know who the victors may or may not be, but this is where we find ourselves. So let's move forward, and let's, as a city, accept and acknowledge that this is where we are. So I am viewing this as an opportunity for citizens of this Toronto, citizens of the city to finally have some semblance of cohesion, some semblance of ability to move forward on transit, and move forward on the big picture issues that actually matter to you. Of course, what happens in your backyard is important. Of course, what happens on your curb is important. But we haven't had a discussion in this city for as long as I've been here that is really what matters to the totality of us moving forward. And so I know what I'm saying is very broad, and we will dive in deeper, but if I just sort of sit back and look at when I have the very, very limited resources that I have these days and able to cover this broad city and the important issues that matter, I look at talking about the 25 wards that we are about to have as the focus of this municipal election, and when we're in election day in 3 weeks from today. And so that's where I focus on, and I look at where the incumbents are, where their voting records are, what they have done to perhaps move the city forward, not just looking at their own sort of NIMBYism, but moving us forward broadly. Transit is an issue, taxes are an issue, housing is an issue, affordability is perhaps the biggest issue. Crime right now in the city, maybe perhaps not for, with all due respect to the crowd that's here tonight, but that's a big reality for a lot of Torontonians. And last night we had a debate in the city, and that came up repeatedly over and over again. And we got a lot of platitudes, we got a lot of words that frankly don't mean a goddamn thing to anybody, especially for those that live in the communities in which crime is a significant issue. And it is problematic in my perspective, not only as a resident of Toronto, but just as a citizen, that we don't have leadership that is prepared to tackle certain aspects that may be uncomfortable and may be awkward and may not be politically correct, and have the language and have the ability to say things and do things that will make a difference for the average citizen. And so I bring this all back to our initial point of this whole panel is whereas we in the media cover this. And so though, yes, I am a member of the media, but I'm a resident of Toronto. and this stuff matters to me. And so that does, in often cases, dictate how we do handle and tackle issues. Personal experiences matter, but overarching city-related issues, we have a big problem on our hands right now. And to be quite candid, I don't think either any of the mayoralty candidates or any of the city councillors that are either vying for or already in their municipal positions have the wherewithal to tackle it. And I think I will leave it at that, Rob.
I think that sets the stage very nicely. John Michael McGrath is a reporter and columnist with TVO.org, where he focuses on provincial and municipal politics. John Michael started covering Toronto City Hall in 2010, including that year's council elections before moving to Queen's Park in 2013. He writes a twice-weekly column for TVO.org and hosts a podcast focused on provincial politics.
Thank you very much for that. As Rob mentioned, I am now at Queen's Park. I haven't covered Toronto City Council directly for a few years now, but I'm one of those obsessives who still gets the council agendas emailed to me, so I think I can still comment on this fairly. Adrian has alluded to some of the difficulties in the current media environment, the media industry, and I actually want to talk about that a bit more because I think it has a very specific impact with the way that Toronto City Council politics end up on the doorstep at Queen's Park very, very frequently, and maybe, frankly, more often than they should. About a year and a bit ago, June of 2017, some people in this room probably remember there was a big argument happening between the then Liberal government at Queen's Park and Mayor John Tory over who was doing enough to fund Toronto community housing. And it's the same argument the city always has. They want money, somebody else has money, and how do they get the money? What was odd about this argument was that eventually the Minister of Housing called reporters together for what he called a technical briefing, and for non-journalists in the audience, a technical briefing usually doesn't involve an elected official. It usually involves non-political staffers who are there to try and give you something relatively free of spin. But this was the minister with a PowerPoint deck giving his comments on the government's agenda. And when he was asked by a reporter what was going on, why this thing was happening this way, he said, well, actually, the mayor has easier access to microphones and cameras than we do, and we're just trying to get our message out. And I thought that was a really interesting admission, because we're not used to thinking of the province as somehow, or in any way, subordinate to the city, and we're not used to thinking of the city as more influential than the province. And yet that was effectively what the admission was. And I don't think the minister was lying, and I don't think he was making it up. The Queen's Park Press Gallery is smaller than it used to be. In the press gallery at Queen's Park, we have portraits up of past press galleries, and the ones that are older tend to have more people in them, and the recent ones tend to have fewer people in them. That's changing a bit lately with, we've had more digital news come to Queen's Park. But the reality is that it's not just fewer news organizations at Queen's Park. They are far more concentrated in Toronto. It's Toronto reporters answering to Toronto editors. And I think my argument today would be that that explains a lot of what we've seen over the last, I would say, decade, where Toronto council issues have keep getting brought to Queen's Park, not just because Toronto is an important city. Toronto is an important city. Toronto handles a lot of big ticket items. Issues like Toronto Transit are always going to make their way to Queen's Park. But Peel Region has something like a bit less than half as many people as Toronto. I could name 4 or 5 major issues that were Toronto City Council issues that consumed days and weeks of time at Queen's Park. Things like, the Liberals eventually, unraveling the OMB a little bit, repeated transit crises, rent control, things that really were answering very specific Toronto-focused concerns. And there is no city in this province, no other city in this province, or even several cities in this province that get that level of attention from Queen's Park. What does this mean for the election? Well, I think as much as we can talk about Doug Ford's particular attention to Toronto City Council recently, my argument would be that this was going to happen no matter who won the election in June. That because of the media structure, because it's, again, Toronto reporters and Toronto editors, frankly, assigning Toronto stories, that a lot of, frankly, a disproportionate focus is going to be paid to Toronto issues, which means that whoever the next mayor is, whether it's John Tory or somebody else, they're going to have to deal with this. It leads to some kind of weird places. The Progressive Conservative Party, a fiscally conservative party, is pledged to spend billions of dollars on subways with dubious business cases, I would say. But that's where our politics have led to. It's not to say that Toronto-based media can't do good regional reporting. I'm looking at some colleagues from the Toronto Star here today, and of course the Star did some excellent reporting about mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. Grassy Narrows is about as far from Toronto as you can get before you hit the Manitoba border, so it's certainly possible, but I don't think that it answers the daily problem of which issues get raised at Queen's Park.
So we're unfairly skewed towards Toronto in our provincial policies because the Toronto media is sort of leading us in that
Yeah, and I
direction.
should say, of course, I am a member of the Toronto media, so my employer has hired other reporters outside, but I am part of the problem insofar.
So let's go to Maria Sarasvutsinas, who serves as the Executive Director of the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada, a nonprofit organization that works with independent ethnic media partners to ensure that Canada's diversity is celebrated.
Rob. Hello, everyone. So we're very different because, as Rob mentioned, we've got close to 800 independent ethnic media outlets that are part of the organization across Canada. Majority of those are based within Toronto. So you've got hundreds of ethnic community papers in Toronto, not just newspapers. We've got digital, there's radio and broadcast as well. And over 100 languages are covered. So we now become the gateway to both new Canadians as well as immigrants that have been here for decades but still feel more comfortable reading the news in their mother tongue. So you've got hundreds of journalists that, getting access to politicians. Like these guys are all, they're educating the readership on, and a lot of the readership come from countries where democracy didn't exist. So here you are, you're educating them now on, these are our elections, this is how democracy works. You have to be an informed voter. How do you do that? It is really difficult. You can't have hundreds of these independent journalists going into council meetings or, interviewing mayoral candidates. So what we do is on a monthly basis, we have meetings and we'll introduce candidates. Over the past couple of months, we've had the two main contenders for the mayoralty come and speak to our members. So we had 80 members there, and it's almost like a one-on-one. So they hear what their platforms are, they're able to report them in their languages and ask questions. So it's kind of like it's a great door for them to get the information out. Now, for me, I'm housed within City Hall. I have to disseminate all this information to all of my members. And a lot of them, English is a second language. So again, there's that difficulty is you've got to make sure that what they're reporting on is accurate as well. It becomes difficult. When issues arise, there's a lot of questions. If people don't understand, we've got to, so I'm dealing with hundreds of these fantastic journalists and just making sure that everything, all the information is getting out there, people are understanding, that their readership are informed, and that's the message that we have to keep pushing. And another thing is, you'll notice that there are a lot of candidates now that come from different ethnic communities. So a lot of their newspapers are going to be supporting these candidates. So another thing we try to do is to bring in a little bit more fairness and say, we get it. You're, the largest Filipino newspaper in Canada. You're focusing on these elections right now. You're going to, introduce your readership to the Filipino candidates out there. But we do, when we bring in candidates into our meetings that are from different communities, it's another opening for their communities to understand, okay, this is, a candidate from the Tamil community. This is what their platform is. So it opens it up a little bit more.
Thank you. So that's a whole other dimension that also brings us well beyond just Toronto into the broader regions around Toronto and across the province. Yeah. Let me now introduce Noor Javed. She's an award-winning reporter for the Toronto Star, who covers everything from suburban city politics to human interest stories, to features about the GTA's diverse communities. Over the past few years, Noor has focused her attention on municipal politics in the 905. Her recent investigation on racial and fiscal turmoil in York Region's Public School Board led to the dismissal of the Director of Education. I think most of us are familiar with that work. Noor?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I feel like all the discussion so far has led to kind of what I cover in a way. So I cover the part of Toronto that was largely ignored recently by the Queen's Park. I mean, Toronto's council was touched, but the other 24 municipalities in the GTA were left unscathed for the most part. Except for, of course, the regional elections in Peel and in York. So for those who might not know, this year, York region voters and Peel region voters were going to have the opportunity to elect their chair of the region for the first time. So outside of Toronto, there are two-tier governments. There's a local and there's a regional. But for some reason, the current government decided they didn't want people to have a fair share at democracy up there. So they decided that they don't want electors to have a chance to vote for the region. So I cover that part just to start there. So almost 4 million people live in the GTA, which includes Durham, Halton, Peel, and York regions, and are just beyond the borders of Toronto. One street is Toronto, the next street is York, or Miss Peel. And in between those four regions, there are 24 municipalities. Each have their own unique local government, mayors, councillors, bylaws, and obviously their own concerns. But sadly, despite the population, the fact that many people who work and live in Toronto, live in the suburbs, there's no real media that really dedicates their time and attention to the suburbs in the GTA. There's no mainstream media that consistently covers the 905. And if you kind of based it on the current news coverage, you think, okay, the suburbs are this sort of utopia where nothing really happens, nothing really goes on except for the occasional crime or political scandal that kind of gets, hidden in the headlines when something happens in Toronto. Something mundane happens in Toronto, really, to be honest. The local press up there is mostly Metroland, which covers everything from council going-ons to community events to the odd controversy. But a lot of those journalists are in a tough spot because they're short-staffed, like everyone is. But they also have to find this fine line between, pressing the mayor one day on an issue or a controversy, but then also having a cordial relationship for the next story where they need a comment on the budget or something. And a lot of those community papers are also funded in part by those councils. And so a lot of the editors are really scared to bite the hand that feeds them. And so it really puts those journalists in a tough spot. And I've seen that a lot with my colleagues up in the suburbs who really struggle with how to really push the councils. So it's within this backdrop that of low media coverage that this election is taking place. And in those 24 municipalities, the elections are going to be taking place in October. And it's because I feel that because there's such low media coverage, that voter turnout is pretty low. Last time in 2014, there was just around 30% voter turnout in Vaughan, for example. Incumbents stay in forever. In Milton, Gord Krantz was elected to council in 1965. He became the mayor in 1980. He's running again, and he's going to win. So that just kind of shows you how difficult it is to get an incumbent out. I mean, he's a lovely guy, and he kind of jokes about his fact that he doesn't even campaign. He just kind of shows up. So it's within that context, the Star has had this very interesting relationship about how to cover the suburbs. Years ago, they had a dedicated bureau in the suburbs and in Vaughan, and they covered, lots and lots of stories. But the joke is that, most of the editors don't live north of Bloor. So for them, it's hard to keep that interest of covering the 905. So anyhow, I decided a couple years ago that I was really interested in 905. And since then, I have been able to, write. There's been more stories than I actually have time to write. There's so much going on, just like the city of Toronto. There's, controversies of every kind, and actually even crazier than I would say Toronto. One I covered recently was on the mayor of Stouffville. He built this insane wall in his office of his enemies. I mean, that's still going. It doesn't happen in Toronto, right? So that's still, that's still in front of the court. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Anyhow, I just wanted to really quickly just touch upon some of the issues that I think are happening, some of the major issues that I think are happening across the 905 that are largely being ignored, or by even local municipalities, by the candidates who are running are just trying to get in without really having to answer to any of these big issues. And these are not just trends that you see in York, which I primarily cover, but you're seeing them everywhere. The biggest issue for sure in the 905 has been and continues to be development. The rampant development of the 905 is always the story, because that affects everything. It affects, in the environment, it affects the infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure, it affects traffic. I mean, you go to any place in the 905, people will complain about traffic. And it's because they'll say, oh, this, subdivision got built and there's traffic, or we don't have roads, we don't have hospitals, everything is catching up. And like, John was saying, these cities are growing so fast, but don't really have the ear or the interest of the province. And they need that to build their infrastructure. And that is the constant story that you will see. You don't really need, there was a politician that once told me, the other issue is with development is how closely councils work with developers, and it's going unchecked. There's one person, I basically cover so many municipalities, and I hear these stories day in and day out, and it's very difficult to formally show this relationship. But one mayor once told me he was in the Durham region, that you can get a sense of how friendly a council is with a developer by just driving through a new neighborhood. The size of the streets, the space between homes, the setbacks of schools, the number of parks, all will tell you the story of how that developer, what that relationship is like. And I thought that was really interesting. I live in Vaughan, and I can drive through different communities, and I can see that very clearly. I obviously can't, claim that it's true, but I mean, I think you, yeah, it seems true. I have lots of examples, but there are just so many examples of places where the environment, development and its impact on the environment has become a real issue. Vaughan, Oakville, and I think the interesting thing is, and I was just wondering as I was writing my notes, was the previous provincial government had a big mandate through the Places to Grow Act, and they really pushed councils to intensify, to build condos, to build along major corridors that they plan to kind of build in terms of transportation, and it'll be interesting to see what this government says about intensification and growing on that route. And just, it was interesting. I was also thinking that the environment is. I find that oftentimes the issues are raised when there's something's happening in someone's backyard, but I also feel that the environment is this issue now that I think this current government, provincial government, will have to be careful about, as we saw when that video came out during the election about Doug Ford was telling developers, I'm willing to build on chunks of the Greenbelt. And there was such an uproar that he had to kind of take back his comments. I know I'm probably going over my time.
Well, in fact, we're going to be able to get right back to this, because my first question to all of you guys is going to be, what are the most underreported and important stories on this? So I want to make sure
Sure.
we get
Yeah,
through.
no worries.
Get,
Sorry.
get to Matt. No, don't apologize, because you've queued up the next question very nicely. So let's just wrap up with Matt. Matt, I think by his own description, has been following, analyzing, and delving into wonky, nerdy policy stuff at Toronto City Hall since 2010. He was a city columnist for Metro News for 6 years, and he's currently contributing urban affairs analysis to CBC. And you can follow Matt on Twitter at GraphicMatt. That's capital G, capital M.
Thanks. You don't need to capitalize it if you don't want to, but you can.
I never know about that.
To be proper, you probably should. Yeah, no, the panel thus far has done a really good job of talking about the flaws in a Toronto media that is very overly focused on Toronto. That said, I'm going to focus only on Toronto in my comments to you right now. I want to start by going back in time a ways to a more innocent time, a time when I had hopes and dreams, July this year. Because in July was when I first sort of sat down and started thinking, okay, municipal election year. I write only about municipal politics, so this is an important time for me and a time when I want to try to steer the conversation as much as I can. So in July, before any of the council cut stuff, I sat down and I made a list of the 5 issues that I thought were most important to me for what I cover. What am I most interested in? What are the stuff that I really wanted to focus on? So I'd like to share that list with you now. So the first thing I had on my list was the city's financial situation. Is anybody here for Peter Wallace's discussions at IMFG? Yeah, they're awesome. You should always go to the city manager's address when they're here, because they're one of my favorite events of the year. Last time Peter Wallace was here, he talked about how the city is basically facing 3 potential pathways as far as its budget is concerned. There is what he called the return to core service. That means cutting things. There's the status quo, and there is city building, which means investing in things. The trick was that the only one that allows a city to maintain property tax rates at or below inflation is the one that involves cutting stuff. So if you want to talk even about the status quo, this idea that we can basically have the services at the level we have and keep property taxes at or below the rate of inflation, as candidates for mayor like to say, is not really doable from the perspective of somebody who spent a lot of time looking at these numbers. So that's a big issue for me. At the same time, the land transfer tax that has been a boon for the city is showing signs of slowing down its rate of growth, and that will also have significant impacts on the city. Couple that with the potential, and John can tell you how real this potential is, but the potential for the provincial government to download cost to the city of Toronto over the next few years, you're looking at a financial situation that is not particularly stable. Issue number 2, transit. And there's the Scarborough subway and there's Smart Track and all this stuff that we hear about, but one of the things for me that's fascinating about transit is that Ttc ridership went up and up and up and up. I'm going to make a graph with my hands. It sort of went like this, and then a few years ago, it started to flatline. And that is something that we're seeing in many cities across North America, and nobody has really been able to pinpoint why. But in Toronto, it's concerning because we want to see transit ridership increasing, because the alternative might be more people driving their cars around, which has external costs and all that stuff. So that's a concern. And before the election, the TTC launched a new ridership growth strategy with the idea that the way to reverse this trend was to really invest in service. But if you have some issues with the budget, one of the first things that might go is some of that increased transit service, because somebody might argue, hey, we are not seeing the ridership, so let's cut the service to match the ridership, which can lead to kind of like a transit death spiral, where we just keep going round and round and round and losing service, losing ridership, losing service. So that was issue number 2 in transit. Issue number 3, affordable housing. Adrian mentioned it. In 2014, most polls I saw said transit was the number 1 issue for voters. This year, many of the polls I'm seeing say it is the cost of housing. And this is a tricky one because there's no obvious quick fix to the cost of housing in Toronto being crazy high. Some people would argue you could build your way out of it. Some people say it's about rent controls and other policies like that. Probably a combination of a bunch of things, but it's a big issue that deserves a lot of attention. Road safety, Vision Zero, we talked a lot about that. The City of Toronto has set records and not good records for the number of pedestrians, particularly, but also cyclists getting killed on its streets over the last few years. Most people are in agreement that this is bad. Mostly everybody is in agreement that this is a bad thing. And most people are even in agreement that we need to spend money on strategies to fix it. But where it gets tricky is when you actually get down to that street level and you start saying, okay, the way to make this street safer is to make it narrower, or to ban right turns or left turns here, or to put in photo radar so you'll get tickets when they speed down the street. And that's the kind of stuff we need answers on, because it's very easy for a politician to say, yeah, I'll support investing 50, 100, $150 million into this. But when it comes down to what are they approving, that's the question. And lastly, it's policing. And this has been mentioned as well. It's been a tragic year on Toronto streets. But at the same time, something the city did a couple of years ago is they launched a transformation task force for the police, with the idea that the police budget is $1 billion. It's the biggest line item the city pays for. And they've done some work on that, but there's going to be, and there already is, a tension between the violence we're seeing on the streets and the calls to change the way policing works, to change the police budget, to maybe look at making the police budget lower. And when we have seen a violent year like this, the political answer, the easy answer, is to just sort of throw money at it. And that is something that I think we need to be asking candidates about. So those were my 5. We are 3 weeks away from the election, and we haven't really talked at length about any of them in any kind of policy detail. So I do want to say one of the things that I'm doing, I'm going to try my darndest to make it about the issues. And one of the things that you can look forward to in this week, actually, is the CBC is launching their vote compass for the mayoral election. But not just the mayoral election. For the first time ever, it's also going to apply to individual council races. So people will be able to log on and see the views of councillors. And one of the ways that we are making that happen is I teamed up with Gabe Edelman and his Urban Policy Lab at U of T. And we have used council voting records to sort of tell you what the views are of incumbent councillors. So we haven't just sent them a survey, though we have done that as well, and said, hey, what are your views on taxes or transit or road safety? We've looked at their actual votes on council, and we have made that information available to you. So that's going to launch really, really soon. So look forward to that. I'm very excited about it. And it's just one small way of getting back to what the issues, I think, would have been if this election hadn't sort of fallen to chaos as it did over the summer. So 3 weeks is not a long time, but I am going to do my best, and I think all of us in the media are going to do our best to really try to bring it back to the issues now.
I think that tool is particularly important at this order of government because, and this may be one of the unspoken points we don't even talk about because it's so obvious. But part of the disengagement that a lot of people feel with municipal government, it seems to me, is that we're not operating with parties. And because we don't have parties, we don't have party platforms. And because we don't have party platforms, we also don't identify naturally with one party or another. And then suddenly election day pops up and the person whose name you've seen on the lawn next to yours is the one that you sort of vote for because you like your neighbor.
Yeah.
So having a vote compass on this kind of election, particularly at the council level, is so critical. And if you've used it provincially or federally, you'll know how useful these things are even more so at this level. So that's awesome. The first question I wanted to throw out actually is one that I think Matt and Noor have already started to answer. So I want to start actually with Maria, if I can, and then we'll go through in this direction and then wrap up with you guys. And that is what issues do you feel are most important and least reported? This is the reporter's question. The most important and least reported issues in the municipal elections, and underscoring the point I think that Noor was making, this is not hosted by the Institute on Toronto Finance and Governance, it's hosted by the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance. So elections in whatever dimension that you think. Maria, why don't we start with you?
So with us in ethnic media, unfortunately, there are very, very few dailies. So a lot of these publications are weekly, monthly. So any type of reporting that you're going to put out there it's almost like everything's underreported. So when you're looking at racialized communities, there's always going to be a focus on what affects them and what's important to them. That is the main issue. And I know that in speaking with my members, they find that affordable housing, even though we may think that it's always on the forefront, it's not being brought up enough. It's a huge issue. When you've got new Canadians coming into the country, with limited means, and they're trying to navigate through this crazy expensive city, there's just not enough information out there. And that's something that we're working on, and we're trying to, work with our elected representatives, to figure out, where is this information and, how can we get it out? I mean, that for us is a huge issue, as is transit as well.
Affordable housing also obviously breaks down. There's not just one housing issue. There's elder housing, immigrant housing, housing for youth, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
I mean, in terms of the issue that I think has been underreported the most, I would, nod towards Matt and say that I think, at least in terms of Toronto, we just are not in this election season really talking about the fiscal state of the city. Really at all. Certainly not in the terms that, we should be, given what we know from past city managers. On the housing file, you mentioned the difference between like elder housing versus affordable housing versus various things like that. But I think the other issue is that, in Toronto, we have tended to look at housing development as I think effectively driven by where we're putting the transit lines. So like Yonge and Eglinton, where TVO's offices are, sees an incredible amount of development because we're still waiting for the crosstown to open. But outside of Toronto, and I think Noor could probably speak to this as well, I mean, one of the big questions for, the Premier has talked about wanting to unlock, new development in the GTA. But one of the things that developers are waiting on is like water infrastructure that just is not being built. In York Region, there are projects that are waiting on development charge revenues to come in that have come in under their projections. So this broader question of housing affordability, there are also, very fundamental questions of who is going to pay for the infrastructure networks. And we're not even talking about like water infrastructure is surprisingly big ticket, but we're not talking about, subways to Richmond Hill. We're talking about, basic like sanitary sewers and water and roads and who's going to pay for that. 40 years ago, Peel Region did not pay for its water infrastructure. That was built with provincial grants. Now we have devolved those expenses first to municipalities, and the municipalities have in turn, made more use of development charges. And the idea of unlocking land for development is sort of all wrapped up in this knot.
It strikes me, actually, this is also a unique characteristic of municipal and regional politics, which is that so many of the critical issues are things that by definition fall between the cracks or fall ostensibly outside the jurisdiction, or no one quite knows if they're in the jurisdiction, so they're not talked about as if they were in the jurisdiction. I remember when I used to work for Paul Martin, and he was all over city stuff, and he could afford to be because he had no direct responsibility for it as a federal politician. But this was always the example he gave, was that I go around and municipalities want to expand, and they can't get the water infrastructure, and the provinces don't want to build it for them, so it falls between the cracks.
Well, I mean, housing is just a maddening policy file because, yes, there's federal involvement with like development financing and like CMHC, and then there's provincial involvement now with like the growth plan and infrastructure funding, and then you get right down to municipal level zoning decisions, and is a bus route going to be put past this development or not? Because all three levels of government are involved, it's very difficult to actually put together a coherent vision.
So there's a few truthisms I'm going to give you. Governments don't give a shit about what happens unless it's in a 4-year election cycle. That's a fact. It's an absolute fact. I know it's uncomfortable. I know no one wants to hear that. I know it's troubling, but it is a reality. I don't care if they're left, right, center, NDP, conservative, liberal. They think of what they're going to do in an expedient amount of time within that 4-year window whereby they can get reelected. That is a fact. And it's troubling, it's uncomfortable, but it is a very big reality that we face all the time. It doesn't matter if it's a municipal level of government, if it's a provincial or federal. And it is something that we as citizens need to acknowledge and accept because we keep giving them our power to them to make the decisions for us. And unless we as citizens hold them accountable for those decisions, then it will just be the status quo over and over and over again. And frankly, that is what we have seen repeatedly, not only in the city of Toronto. And by the way, when my introduction was given, I was raised in Saskatchewan. We are like raised to hate Toronto. So it is like a bit ironic that I'm sitting here, defending or advocating for the realities of Toronto politics these days. But
Thank you for your sacrifice.
that's just a fact. Thank you. Thank you. That's a fact. I'm just that's just candidly. But with respect to the underreportedness, it always comes down to the money. Everything comes down to the money. how we align our budgets, how we actually decide what we're going to invest in. Yeah, we can talk about, proper water and proper infrastructure and the realities of the fact that the Toronto community housing is, that the city of Toronto is the worst slumlord in the country. And it is frankly unconscionable that those that promote to be the advocates for those that are the most vulnerable in our society are allowing those individuals to live in the most derelict of conditions. Yet then they will turn around and say, oh, we have an extra $100 million from, another level of government. Let's go invest in some fancy little thing over here. Rather than doing fixing and actually making living conditions for those individuals to be productive members of society, that is what we're dealing with. That is the reality. So the money is what matters. It's not a matter, ladies and gentlemen, of not having enough taxes. There's enough. We all pay enough. It's how they utilize the resources that they have. And I would submit that every level of government, regardless of political stripe, has abdicated their responsibility on actually doing what matters to the average citizen. They're far more interested in their own pet projects. They're far more interested in getting reelected than they are in actually doing what's right. And so with that said, I hand over the microphone.
That sort of cues up, that cues up Matt at the other end of the table, right? Because you were just talking about what the city manager was saying, these 4 options. So do we have all the money we need? We're just putting it in the wrong places?
I mean, there is a waste at every level of government, and good governments are always looking for ways to make themselves more efficient. But, I mean, the city of Toronto has had 8 years now of mayors who have been elected saying they're going to root out all the waste, or gravy as it was once known, and have not been very effective at improving the city's overall fiscal situation. So underreported story for me is always thinking, like a fact, and this is, you can't really argue with this, is that if the city of Toronto raised its average residential property tax bill to the GTA average, which is about what Markham pays, many of the things the city says we just don't have the money to do, it would suddenly find itself able to do, or at least pay for. There is a translation between having the money and having something in effect. So this idea that the city doesn't have the capability to find money is something that is not entirely true. And the pushback at Queen's Park for years has always been when the city of Toronto is doing the thing where they are crying that they just don't have the cash for this or that and the province needs to give them the money. People at Queen's Park are saying like they have the lowest average property taxes in the GTA, maybe second next to Milton, but they have very, very low property taxes, and it seems like there's an argument to be made whenever Queen's Park gives the city money, that money actually ends up going towards keeping those property taxes at that low rate so the municipal politicians can benefit and stay elected. So I think, I've been beating this drum for years on property taxes. The city needs to have a really honest conversation with itself about property tax levels, where they are in relation to the GTA, what they're being used for, and what they should be over the long term.
Really interesting, because we're really getting a very clear sense now of the difference, this huge difference between the way a municipal election, the dynamics of municipal politics in the city of Toronto and in the 905, where it seems that there are fundamentally different kinds of issues. Obviously, city finance is city finance, and it exists as a critical issue in any region. But over to you, Noor, to sort of close this up about what are the most important underreported stories. Clearly, you would be out reporting them because that's what you do. But
I mean, I honestly think in the 905, the biggest issue is apathy. People
apathy.
Just don't care. I mean, I haven't done any kind of scientific assessment or study, but I'm sure if you walk around and ask people, do you know what your regional council is, where 50% of your taxes go? I don't think people would even know. And I think that's why a lot of things are happening in the 905 that are just under the radar in terms of, negotiations and deals that I've written about with developers and money being just spent like really crazily about councils, and other issues that are now starting to prop up. A big issue that I just wanted to, affordable housing and poverty and crime is huge in the 905. I mean, we keep hearing about issues in Peel region. There's I was just reading a story recently about, I think they've had like 20 murders this year in Peel region. Half of them have been through gun violence, but the police chief was asking the province for some of the funding that the province is giving Toronto towards gun violence. Like things like that are just, no one's talking about it, but how, the borders aren't like, really big, between Toronto and Peel in these areas. So that's the big thing. The other thing I find that's really interesting that no one's really talking about is racial and religious tensions that are really brewing in the 905. There were, in 2017, there were almost 200 or 158 incidents of hate crime in Peel region. There's been so many stories in the news of people getting beat up because of how they look, of their, of their religion, there's been a lot of stories. And I think when you look at these really highly diverse areas and the fact that, all councillors are just not even addressing this issue, I think it's really scary because people on the ground are talking about it. The police is talking about it. Recently in Markham, there were these anti-refugee protests out of nowhere. Everyone's like, what's going on in Markham? And they were being led by the Chinese community. And so there's a lot of this is happening in the 905, and especially I would say because that area there's so many new recent immigrants, there's a lot of interesting dynamics happening there, and I feel like this is an issue that people are really interested in. I mean, those stories get a lot of traction, they get a lot of popularity. A lot of candidates use those issues to propel themselves, but no one is really talking about it, and I find that's really interesting.
I had another question, but I'm going to put my question on hold because there are way more of you than me, and you have more interesting ideas than I do, I'm sure. So why don't we just open up and just start with some questions from... Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there's a microphone there. Great.
Hello, my name is Astrid Burka. I just wanted to know, how can you as the media influence better solutions rather than always portraying the problems? Because there are solutions, and I think what I'm always hearing is affordable housing. Okay, I could build 100,000. Why don't you start challenging them at a deeper level to get the answers? Because we're not really hearing any answers ever. It's all political blah blah. So how could you influence our elective group to actually give us real answers?
So that's an excellent question. And that's something I think that all of us strive for on a regular basis. Here's our reality. Have you ever heard the term, if it bleeds, it leads? We're in the business of business in a way, and that may not comport with the idea of giving the solution. So even though I appreciate and I respect, and again, as a citizen, I want to be able to have for my readers that opportunity to have that solution, we are not often in a position to give that. We don't have the expertise to do that. We can find and seek out those experts that are able to articulate it, but it's a matter of putting pressure on those that are in those positions that can make the difference. We in the media can embarrass them, we can expose them, we can, sort of pigeonhole them into giving us an answer. But at the end of the day, far too often things happen either on a partisan line or a philosophical line, and they're going to do whatever the hell they want anyway. So I genuinely appreciate what you're saying, because I feel it too, constantly. But we are, sorry, my mom's calling me right now. I missed Mother Batra's
can hear
call.
you.
That's a big deal. But it's a constant struggle, because how often do we say it's called question period, not answer period? But we want solutions, and we can bitch and complain, which we do, and we write editorials and we write opinion pieces and we write our positions in which we do to try to get them to almost force them into a position. There's no elegant solution to it. We try, and we all try in our own way, and all the media outlets that we work for. But ultimately, it is really a matter of, and I come back to this, it's a matter of citizens pushing their elected officials to come up with the solutions.
There, John.
I would just also say that it's not always obvious what the solutions are. I mean, we've mentioned affordable housing here a few times tonight, and how many people in this room want to sell their house for half of its sticker price tonight? Like, one. But, you know, when we talk about affordability, you know, when Kathleen Wynne introduced the Fair Housing Plan, you know, I was at the press conference and I sort of asked, you know, what does success look like a year from now if this works? And the answer that I got from the finance minister was, well, we want housing prices to be about where they are. We just want them to stop climbing. We don't want them to shrink anymore. And because homeowners across the province have an incredible amount invested in their houses, and like it's the retirement account for a lot of people, you know, I don't, believe me, I've been yakking about housing policy for nearly a decade now, and I don't have the answer to it.
There's an interesting movement actually in journalism right now around something that I think my colleagues will be familiar with called solutions journalism. It comes originally out of the New York Times. They have a column there called the Fix It column or the Fixer column. And if you're interested, there's an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network.org. We actually work with them in my program. And the principal idea there is exactly the insight that you're raising, which is that people tend to dissociate and become alienated from the whole political process when all they read is negative news. And there's neurological science behind that as well. And that actually what journalists can also do is apply the disciplines of investigative journalism to look for solutions that have happened, say, in one region or one jurisdiction, and then ask the question, what has actually worked, what hasn't worked, how did that actually come into play? And to what degree can that be translated into the jurisdiction that I'm writing for, you know? And that's becoming a wider and wider practice. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But let me go on to next question.
Thank you. My name is Michael Roschlau. I took note earlier of a mention of the relationship between municipal politicians and developers. And this is an issue that, to my knowledge, we have campaign contribution regulations at the federal and provincial levels. We may not have as much at the municipal level. And I'm wondering what you all know about that relationship, the extent to which campaigns are funded by contributions from developers. I see very little reporting on it. I do vaguely remember the total number across Ontario is somewhere in excess of 60%. Correct me if I'm wrong. But why do we not hear more about this? And what is the impact of it, and how does it distort the decisions that get made at municipal councils? And is it not a conflict of interest of some kind?
So I think we should probably start with Noor on that one because you've done a lot of coverage of this area.
Yeah, I have. You know, I'm actually currently on mat leave, so I know that the numbers has changed recently, and so I don't want to be quoted because I know that there is a limit now in terms of what developers can give to councillors. But it's a very, very good question, and it comes up a lot in municipal councils about you know, the relationship when a developer or his secretary or his wife, because that's how it's done, contributes to a counselor. And I know there is a professor at York University who's done a number of studies on relationships in York Region between counselors and developers. And, you know, he found that I think almost all but one, for example, in Vaughan, councillors had taken developer dollars, right? And I think there is a very, very good question there about how this manifests when the votes come up to approve a development or to increase density. The thing is, there's not enough journalists really on the ground to analyze this. Mm-hmm. And this has been something that, you know, my colleagues and I at STAR have always talked about. Someone needs to sit there and look at votes because the truth is that oftentimes in my coverage, I have seen that councillors don't declare conflict because no one's watching. And there's no obligation for them to do so, right? And a number of stories that I have written about, you know, certain things being approved, later on we have seen through, you know, kind of citizen advocates who are kind of filing FOIs or in camera meeting, you know, things like that, that we'll find out that there has been a conflict. But by that time, the issue is already approved. So I would say it is for sure, it is a huge issue. It's completely underreported. No one is looking at it.
Adrian?
So it's an excellent question. And say what you will about that notion when you hear special interests have overtaken our politics, and you generally hear that from someone like a Doug Ford or a Rob Ford. You've heard that, right? They're not wrong. They're not. I'm going to answer this question as best as, actually, I'm not even really going to answer it. I'm just going to sort of give you perspective from my side of the aisle. So when I worked in the office of the mayor, one of the things that we were very cognizant of is that decisions that we made in that office every day were either going to make someone money or lose someone money. And usually it was because some lobbyist or developer was coming for something cap in hand. And I, as in the capacity in which I served in the mayor's office, I generally stayed away from those sorts of things, but my colleagues dealt with it directly. We didn't meet with a lot of lobbyists, shockingly, in Rob Ford's administration, as much as that may surprise people. We kind of kept them at bay to a degree. Of course, they were accessible, and of course, they had access, but it wasn't as rampant as we've seen at the provincial level with the Liberal government, with cash for access and all those sorts of things. But we also knew that they had clients that they had to represent. And again, it didn't matter what political philosophy, left, right, center, councillors are, we kind of knew how they were going to vote, and we knew who was lobbying them, and we knew what vested interest that they had in their respective ward. We also had this thing called Section 33 money. Where the heck does that go? Why is that not held accountable? Why is no one looking at those sorts of things? Why is it that we're giving all of these developers this sort of special allowance to just, oh, by the way, we're going to like throw a little playground in there for you and just give us this allowance for Section 33 money? It is not the way that it should operate. So that is my sort of political staffer answer. And then on the sort of media perspective answer, I think Noor was quite apt when she said, we just don't have the resources anymore to do a deep dive into this sort of stuff. But it's actually more of a policy change at the municipal level within the Act versus really, as much as we should expose it, it's more about pushing those that are current policymakers to make the change within the legislation to not allow that to happen.
One thing I want to add just to that, it is hard to track developer donations, and part of that is because corporate donations are banned in Toronto, so you have the situation where it's like Mr. Developer is given the maximum, and his wife is given the maximum, and his 18-year-old son who lives in the basement has given the maximum somehow. So that creates it, and it makes it harder to hold them accountable. But I will also say one of the things we're seeing in entrenched neighborhoods is, yeah, there's influence from developers, but there's also a very, very strong NIMBY influence by older homeowners. And those two things are at loggerheads sometimes, because there's developers who want to build and there's the homeowners who do not want to even build like a 4 or 6-story mid-rise apartment on a busy transit line, for example. So that kind of influence is important for the media to track as well.
Back to you guys.
Hi, it's Paul Bedford. I have 3 questions that I wanted to kind of wrap into one and pick up on Matt's comments. You've all talked about affordable housing, the transit crisis or problem, and the lack of revenue. So where is inclusionary zoning as a concept? Province has allowed municipalities to use it, but as far as I know, it hasn't come forward. What do you guys think about uploading the subway to the province? What does that really mean, and what's the quid pro quo? And what are new revenue sources that other cities around the world have that Toronto doesn't? We're going to grow to 3.5 million people by 2041 in the city, and we're going to need more of everything. And we're not going to just keep cutting the pie into smaller pieces. So I'd really love to get a discussion on that.
Let's start with John.
I don't know. I can't sit here today and tell you that the Conservative government is going to get rid of inclusionary zoning, but
Someone just explain what inclusionary zoning is.
Yeah, sorry. So inclusionary zoning, the previous Liberal government brought in changes to legislation that would allow municipalities to require as a condition of any kind of large zoning change, like allowing, a 20-story tower, that a certain fraction of the units inside that building would be set aside for affordable housing. And then they dragged their feet a little bit, actually passing the regulations to implement it. They did so right before the election, and then the election happened. And I don't know for a fact that the Conservative government is going to get rid of inclusionary zoning, but all of the language about cutting red tape for developers and unlocking property development. At minimum, I suspect that the Tories are going to substantially limit that power that the Liberals had eventually gotten to the point where they allowed us some pretty broad permissions about where it could and could not be used. With new revenue sources, again, I kind of think Doug Ford is not looking to give the City of Toronto more taxes comparable with other large cities around the world. Toronto is not getting a sales tax. It is not getting an income tax. The idea of uploading the subways, it doesn't have to be bad. It could be. There are ways that you could do it in a way that might leave Toronto okay. It's going to be in the details. Like the subways are actually very expensive, and when I'm in a discharitable mood, I like to point out that the last government's policy was that we still had to build lots of subways to places that didn't justify the ridership, but Toronto was on the hook for paying for it. If Doug Ford's policy is that we still build unwise subways, but the province pays for it, I don't think that's a net loss to the city. So,
Maria, just because we haven't heard from you in the last two questions, you are bringing your editors to hear from a lot of councillors. So I wonder if you have a bit of a sense of some of these issues from what you're hearing.
I think, again, for most ethnic communities, raising taxes is a scary subject. And a lot of the questions that I hear being asked of our politicians are, you're collecting all of this tax revenue, and we're not quite sure where this money's going. We can dive into the details, but it just doesn't make sense. You're bringing in X number of dollars, and I think, Adrian, you brought that up earlier. That is always one of the main questions that comes up. And Ricky, you'll agree with me. When we had John Tory with us last month, that was one of the first questions that was asked, and I don't think it was answered. So again, we just kind of walked our way around it. But that's a big concern.
The real value, I think, in when you bring in the perspective of people who haven't grown up in the Canadian political culture and actually, in many cases, come from environments where governments, to say the least, are not transparent and not to be trusted. Having those questions put bluntly in a way that a person who was born and raised in Canada might not even think to ask is a real value to the political discussion.
Absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question. Over here.
Okay, just first to Matt, this isn't my mother lives in Hamilton and I live in downtown Toronto, and her property taxes are almost 3 times what mine are. So that anecdote does mean something to me. I just have 3 sentences and then a question. I'll try to cut it short, but for this, the salient lesson I've learned about federalism over the last 25 years is that provincial and federal government have only the only real power of consequence. Mike Harris illustrated it most dramatically with downloading and amalgamation, but other premiers have demonstrated this as well, including Doug Ford most recently. More than 20 years ago, I remember Jane Jacobs saying, "We get into trouble politically when power and responsibility become uncoupled." Given that reality, why shouldn't journalists report relentlessly from that perspective? Because I read a lot about the city all the time. I'm fascinated by cities, but I also sense just how little power they have over the fate of their communities, and that should be sort of a role of journalism to educate people on the power structure here, because I think it's maybe not unique, but in other countries, the cities often do have substantially more clout than they do here.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm worried about is people have short memories in politics, and Doug Ford will not be premier forever, but I worry that when that day comes, people will not remember that, we went through something, I think, as a city this summer that regardless of how you felt about it, probably made a lot of people think, hey, why can somebody just do that to our city and our government? And isn't there a better process? Shouldn't we, the City of Toronto, have had more say, especially in the middle of an election, as to what shape that election should take? So I do believe I'm going to do my part, that the issue of powers for municipalities in Canada needs to be a continuing issue and an issue that keeps getting brought up. And there are some people who keep telling me, well, we can't reopen the Constitution. And I would say, well, I mean, if the Constitution is fundamentally flawed when it comes to cities, then maybe that's what we have to do. So, you know, I'm not willing to give up on it. And I know there are lots of people in the same boat.
Never going to happen.
Not Adrian.
No, period. Like, it doesn't matter if it's Justin Trudeau, Stephen Harper, Andrew Scheer, it doesn't matter. They will never open that aspect of the Constitution up, ever.
I wrote something at TVO about how it could happen, but
Of course, it could happen. Anything could happen, but expeditiously and for efficacy purposes, it will never happen. As much as we can vociferously argue for the case of municipal governments to actually be less than considered as a creature of the province, and then for everyone to be less hysterical about what Doug Ford can or cannot do, or even what Kathleen Wynne did when she was premier, or Dalton McGuinty did with respect to the municipalities. There is no federal government that is going to either advocate for or run on giving more power to the municipality. They will speak to it. They will say, we need more accountability. They will give you lip service to all of it. And your question is very thoughtful and on the minds of millions of Canadians, because as I said in my very first few sentences speaking to all of you tonight, the municipal level of government is the one that actually matters to people, the ones where you and I can physically see, feel, and touch things happening. Yet they're the weakest and the most irrelevant, yet the most relevant to the rest of us. So yes,
John,
Constitution.
When you wrote it, what was the scenario that you pictured?
there are multiple ways to amend the Constitution, and not all of them require multiple provinces to agree. You can amend the Constitution so long as it sticks to the affairs of one province. You just need that province and Ottawa to agree, and that's how Quebec, for example, got rid of its separate religious school system. That's how Ontario would have to get rid of its Catholic school system. So far, I have had several people say that I am reading the amending formula correctly, and I've had one person say I am not. But basically, what I suggested is that the province could, probably not this government, but a province could impose some relatively narrow limits on what the power of the legislature is to affect municipalities. This already exists for Catholic schools, right? The legislature cannot fund Catholic schools unequally relative to the existing public school system. This has been in the Constitution as long as we've had a Constitution, and that's a matter of provincial jurisdiction. So my argument is that you could put a relatively straightforward limit on the legislature's power in this very clear area of provincial jurisdiction, and it would not open up the entire can of worms.
And there are also, and I think then we'll wrap up and go to my colleague Sean, but there are also, just having worked in politics too, like Adrian, there are also all sorts of ways that you can work the politics within the restrictions of a constitution, right? You can organize deals. You can actually bring pressure to bear on different orders of government. You can actually, if you're a federal government and you want to corner provincial government in a particular province, but you have an ally in City Hall in the main city in that province, you can work deals that put that corner the provincial government, even if it is not within the strict parameters of the Constitution. It's just that, we've lined up the political forces in such a way. So there's political will, I think, that still operates even within the Constitution. But I just mentioned that because I think if the gentleman believes, as many people do, that these are live issues, I think that they are live issues, not just pending some great constitutional convention that will never happen. These are genuinely live issues. So these are all live issues, and this was a great conversation. Let me introduce my colleague, Shauna Braille.
Well, thank you, everyone, the audience. IMFG, and particularly Enid Slack, who, for those of you who don't know, Enid is the partner extraordinaire. She welcomed our co-sponsorship and did all of the heavy lifting. And also to the panelists, to Rob, to Adrian, John, Maria, Noor, Matt, Thank you very much. We know your time is valuable and there's a lot of pressure on it, and we appreciate very much you sharing your insights and inputs with us. I want to say a couple of words about the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. This is the very first event that the School of Cities, in its official capacity, is co-sponsoring. The school is a very new initiative, just launched July 1st at the university, and its focus is to convene urban-focused researchers, students, organizations, community groups, and the general public to explore and address complex urban challenges. And our aim is just a very large one, to make cities and urban regions more sustainable, more prosperous, more inclusive, and more just. And so it's a real pleasure for us to be here as one of our first events. And I think I know this will be the first of many events that we co-sponsor. We recently released a fall newsletter in which we announced a series of funding opportunities, and I encourage you, if you didn't receive it, to take a look at schoolofcities.com for more details, or to get in touch or speak to Maddie Simiotiki, who's the director, or myself, and we'd be happy to share more details. Prior to this event, we had a conversation with a couple of the panelists about whether or not the election has become kind of dull. The conversation today was anything but dull, really touching on the role of media, the focus on how we need to move to urban issues rather than the pre-election chaos, city finances, transit, congestion, taxes, housing and housing affordability, crime, development, and also, we can't forget, municipal and provincial relations and tension. I want to end with a question to both the panelists and the audience to ask you, in the spirit of taking action and not simply looking for the problems, but also looking for solutions. What, if anything, will you do differently? Will you write? Will you engage following today's discussion and prior to the upcoming election? So thank you very much and look forward to continuing these conversations.